Emiliano Cárdenas was the personification of a forgotten time, a retired sergeant from the Mexican army whose honor and discipline, once forged on training grounds and secret missions, now applied to mundane tasks like watering geraniums dried out by the relentless Ciudad Juárez sun. At 70, his stooped body and slow steps made him invisible on the dusty streets, a specter of a Mexico that no longer existed. Friends, before we dive deep into this journey of pain and retribution, I must sincerely ask for your help. If stories about forgotten men who refuse to bow to injustice resonate with you, help me reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. Please subscribe and comment from which city you are watching this story. Knowing how far these voices reach gives me the strength needed to continue. His routine was a ritual of solitude. The mornings began with bitter coffee, followed by a game of chess against himself, where the methodical strategist of old still fought silent battles on the worn wooden board. Each moved piece was an echo of past decisions, of lives saved and lost. His small, impeccably clean house was a sanctuary of memories, a personal museum where time seemed to have frozen in the decade when his wife, Sophia, was still alive. Silence was his constant companion, a heavy blanket that isolated him from the chaotic noise of a city drowning in its own violence. A violence that he, in his youth, believed he could contain with order and law, but which now overflowed through every crack in society. Ciudad Juárez in the 90s was an open wound on the border. The city Emiliano had known in his youth, with its vibrant squares and promises of a prosperous future, had transformed into a labyrinth of fear. The air was heavy, laden with desert dust, and the palpable tension of the cartel war unfolding in the shadows, and increasingly in broad daylight. For Emiliano, walking those streets was like walking on the rubble of his own convictions. He saw the corruption in the eyes of the police, the hopelessness on the faces of the young, and the audacity of criminals who acted with an impunity that defied the very notion of a state. It was a hostile world he no longer recognized, a place where honor was a worthless currency. The only link that bound him to this desolate present was his grandson, Miguel, a 16-year-old boy with his mother's dreamy eyes and a smile that could, for brief moments, dispel the shadows that inhabited his grandfather's soul. Every week, Emiliano visited Sophia's grave, not just to speak with her memory, but to give her news of the boy, the seed of their love that had blossomed amidst the chaos. He told her about Miguel's grades in school, about his passion for drawing, and about the neighborhood girl who took his breath away. This connection to the past and the promise of a future that Miguel represented was what kept Emiliano from completely surrendering to the twilight of his existence. The relationship between grandfather and grandson was a safe harbor in an ocean of uncertainty. Miguel saw in Emiliano not just an elderly grandfather, but a pillar of silent strength, a man of unwavering principles in a world that seemed to have abandoned all of its own. He was fascinated by the stories of an army that prized loyalty and sacrifice, concepts that sounded like ancient legends against the brutal reality of Juárez. For Emiliano, Miguel was the personification of the innocence he had once sworn to protect, the living proof that despite all the rot, there was still something pure worth fighting for, even if that fight was now waged in the silence of his broken and weary heart. In their last meeting, sitting in the small neighborhood square, the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Miguel spoke enthusiastically about an art contest at school, his broad gestures and hopeful voice contrasting with Emiliano's stillness. The sergeant just listened, absorbing every word, every expression, as if he knew those moments were precious and finite. He handed his grandson a few crumpled bills, insisting he buy better quality art supplies. "An artist needs the right tools to paint the future," he said, with a rare spark of tenderness in his tired gaze, not knowing that Miguel's future would be erased before the first paint could dry. As he said goodbye to his grandson, watching him disappear around the corner with his youthful, bouncing step, a strange, cold sensation ran down Emiliano's spine. It was a sudden chill, a primal instinct honed by decades of service, a silent alarm that screamed danger. He looked at the shadows stretching across the streets, at the cars with tinted windows passing like predators. The city seemed to hold its breath, and in that moment the old sergeant felt the weight of his helplessness. He was just an old man, a relic, unable to protect the only light of his life from the darkness that swallowed everything around him. A grim premonition he tried to dismiss as a phantom of old age. That night, the loneliness in Emiliano's house felt different. It wasn't the familiar quiet, but a heavy, premonitory silence. He sat in his worn armchair, the unfinished chess game on the table, and looked at a faded photograph on the wall. Him, Sophia, and a small Miguel in his arms, smiling towards a future that would never come. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown, each second hammering the anxiety in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but that was the last night of his life as Emiliano Cárdenas, the grandfather. The darkness outside had already claimed his grandson, and soon it would knock on his door to awaken the sergeant who had long been asleep. The knock on the door sounded profane, violating the quiet of the early morning. It was two uniformed police officers, young, with eyes that mixed fatigue and bureaucratic indifference. Their words were direct, devoid of any compassion, as if they were reporting a flat tire and not the annihilation of an entire universe. "Sergeant Cárdenas, I'm Officer Ramirez. We have news about your grandson, Miguel." Emiliano's world stopped. The air in his lungs turned to ground glass. He didn't need to hear the rest of the sentence. The truth was in the officer's posture, in the way they avoided his gaze. A ringing in his ears drowned out the sound of the city, drowned out the policeman's voice, leaving only a cold, absolute certainty. The light of his life had been extinguished, and he was plunged into a total and irrevocable darkness. The morgue was a place where grief became palpable, a cold that seeped into the bones and froze the soul. Under the cold, white light of the fluorescent lamps, Emiliano walked like an automaton to the metal table. The white sheet covering his grandson seemed like a shroud for all his hopes. When the medical examiner pulled it back, the air escaped his lungs in a silent groan. There was Miguel, but it wasn't him. The young face, which he had seen smiling just hours before, was marked by the brutality of hatred, a mask of violence that disfigured his innocence. Emiliano touched his grandson's cold hand, the skin once warm and full of life, now icy and inert. In that touch, grief transformed into something harder, sharper, the seed of fury. At the police station, the smell of stale coffee and cynicism permeated the air. Emiliano found himself before Commander Rivera, a man whose flaccid face he knew from other times, a face that now displayed the map of corruption. Rivera treated him with a cruel condescension, flipping through the case file with an insulting disinterest. "Emiliano, times have changed. Your grandson probably got involved with the wrong people." "It happens," he said with a shrug. "We'll file it as a score settling between gangs. It simplifies the paperwork." Every word was a blow, a humiliation that dishonored not only Miguel's memory, but the very uniform Emiliano had once worn with pride. The institution he served was mocking his pain, protecting the monsters who killed his boy. He left the station, and the morning sun blinded him, but the world seemed darker than ever. The city, once just a backdrop to his solitude, now revealed itself as a concrete jungle, ruled by predators who wore suits or uniforms. Rivera's betrayal was the final nail in the coffin of his faith in the system. Justice wasn't blind. She was blindfolded and gagged, serving whoever paid the most. As he walked the streets, the pain in his chest began to crystallize, turning into an icy clarity. There would be no justice for Miguel. There would be no investigation. His grandson's name would be just another number in a forgotten statistic. In that moment, the citizen Emiliano Cárdenas died, and from his ashes, the sergeant began to stir, not to serve the law, but to become the law itself. Back in his silent house, Emiliano stood before the hallway mirror. He saw the reflection of a weak old man, his shoulders slumped by the weight of grief and age. But behind that frail facade, his eyes burned with a new and terrible determination. Justice was dead, and the law was a farce. If the world refused to give Miguel the right to justice, he would give him vengeance. It was a decision made in the abyss of solitude, a silent vow that sealed his fate. It is for men like him, forced to walk a dark path alone, that I ask for your support. Subscribing to this channel is more than a click. It is an act that gives me the strength to continue telling the stories of those who have been silenced. Your subscription is my ammunition. The decision, once made, altered the very atmosphere of his house. The silence that was once of mourning was now charged with purpose, a tense stillness that precedes a storm. Emiliano went to the back of his closet, where an old wooden box rested under a dusty sheet, untouched for decades. His age-worn hands slid over the rough wood, feeling the grooves as if they were the scars of his own life. That chest didn't just hold objects, it contained the man he had been, Sergeant Cárdenas, an individual of iron discipline and unquestionable duty. As he lifted the heavy lid, the smell of mothballs and aged wool rose, bringing with it the ghosts of a past he thought he had buried forever, along with his youth and his illusions. Inside the box, his military life was meticulously preserved. The army uniform, folded with a precision that time had not dared to undo, still showed the creases of its last use. Beside it, service medals, their shine dulled by the patina of years, rested on faded velvet. Each one told a story of sacrifice, of loyalty to a homeland that had now abandoned him. He touched the rough fabric of the uniform, a shiver running through his body. It was not nostalgia that moved him, but the rediscovery of an identity. He wasn't unearthing memories, he was exhuming weapons. That uniform was a skin he needed to wear again, not on the outside, but on the inside, rekindling. The warrior's flame beneath the old man's ashes. His fingers finally found the cold, familiar weight of the standard-issue pistol, wrapped in an oiled cloth. As he held it, his hands trembled, not from weakness, but from a long, dormant energy flowing back into his veins. The steel felt like an extension of his will. Sitting at the kitchen table, under the dim light of a single bulb, he disassembled the weapon with a soldier's muscle memory. Each click of the pieces snapping into place was a note in the symphony of his resurrection. The grease on his fingers, the smell of solvent, all of it was a ritual that cleansed him of helplessness and anointed him with the certainty of his new mission. The pistol was no longer a government artifact. It was his tool of justice, the instrument of his personal and non-transferable vengeance. His first move was not driven by brute force, but by strategy, the greatest weapon of a veteran soldier. He knew that information was the key to dismantling any enemy. Sitting at the same table, he opened his savings passbook. His life savings, put away for a peaceful old age that had been stolen from him, would now become his war fund. Every peso saved with sweat and discipline would be invested in buying secrets. In the exchange of whispers in the darkest corners of Juárez. He had no army, no state support. His only resources were his mind, his determination, and that wad of cash that represented the annulment of his future in favor of a bloody retribution in the present. It was an investment from which he expected no return, only a final reckoning. The next night, Emiliano entered a foul cantina on the outskirts, a place where hopelessness was served in dirty glasses and secrets had a price. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of drunken conversations. He, with his erect posture and austere silence, was an anomaly in that environment. He approached a known informant, a sewer rat, whose loyalty belonged only to the highest bidder. Sliding a few bills across the sticky table, Emiliano asked his question in a low, firm voice that allowed for no evasion. The informant hesitated, but the old sergeant's gaze, as cold as the steel of a bayonet, made him yield. He left with a name, Flaco, the lookout, the first domino he was about to topple. The hunt began. For 3 days, Emiliano became a shadow, observing Flaco's movements. He studied the routine of the young dealer, an arrogant kid drowning in his own sense of power. Emiliano saw in him not a monster, but a symptom of the disease consuming the city. He mapped his schedules, the streets he frequented, the moments he let his guard down. This reconnaissance phase was crucial. His aging body would not allow for a direct confrontation or a chase. He had to be the predator that sets the perfect ambush, using patience as his primary virtue and knowledge of the urban terrain as his ally. Every observed detail was another line on the map that would lead him to his first revenge. He chose the location with a cruel symbolism, a narrow dead-end alley covered in trash and darkness, a mirror of the place where Miguel's body was found. Using the night as his cloak, he set the stage, a strategic noise to draw attention, an obstacle placed to slow any escape attempt. The tension was electric, a heavy silence broken only by the distant sound of a siren and the frantic beating of his own heart. Emiliano felt no fear, but an icy clarity, the focus of a surgeon before making the first incision. He was in control, transforming the urban landscape into his personal battlefield, where the rules were dictated by him and him alone. The confrontation was swift, clumsy, and brutally real. Flaco, lured into the alley, was met by Emiliano's stooped figure and let out a disdainful laugh. "What is it, Grandpa? Lost your way to the nursing home?" he mocked. It was his last mistake. Emiliano didn't answer with words. He attacked not with the strength of youth, but with the economy of movement and lethal precision of an expert. A blow to the knee, a finger to the eyes, a quick move that used the aggressor's own momentum against him. It wasn't a heroic movie fight, but a dirty, desperate brawl where a lifetime of cunning overcame a moment of brute force. Emiliano won, but at a cost. He was breathless, his chest burned, and every joint in his body screamed in agony. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the fight now dissipated, leaving behind the pain and exhaustion of a 70-year-old body pushed to its limit. With Flaco subdued and terrified, his arrogance replaced by a childish dread, Emiliano extracted the information he needed, the name and whereabouts of the man who pulled the trigger. The victory brought no euphoria. The taste in his mouth was of ashes. He looked at the trembling young man at his feet and saw how far he had fallen, how far the pain had pushed him, realizing that each step on his path of vengeance would take him further from himself. With the second name in hand, he knew he couldn't leave Flaco behind. He was a loose end, a risk his tactical mind could not allow. The act that followed was carried out with a mechanical coldness, the same he used to clean his weapon. It was a grim, unceremonious act, performed in the foul darkness of the alley. As he walked away, leaving behind the first chapter of his revenge, Emiliano felt no relief or satisfaction. He felt only an immense emptiness, the understanding that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a victim or a grieving grandfather. He was a killer, a man who had answered darkness by becoming part of it, and there was no turning back. Flaco's body was discovered the next morning, and the news spread like wildfire. Elena, a young journalist whose idealism had not yet been corroded by the cynicism of Juárez, arrived at the scene. While the police cordoned off the area with procedural laziness, she observed the details that others ignored. The victim was a known cartel member, but the crime scene was strangely clean, almost surgical. There were no signs of a chaotic gang fight. It was something different, something methodical and personal. In her notebook, she scribbled the first questions that would begin her obsession. Who would hunt the hunters with such precision? Meanwhile, Emiliano sought a different kind of refuge. He entered the old church in his neighborhood, sitting in the back pew, a figure shrouded in shadow and pain. The scent of incense and candle wax transported him to other times, but it brought him no peace. Father Francisco, his longtime friend, saw him from the sacristy. The priest knew Emiliano's soul, or at least the soul he used to have. As he approached, he saw something new in his friend's eyes, the fire of hell reflected in a well of infinite sorrow. He knew with a certainty that chilled his heart that Emiliano had begun to walk a path from which very few return. After the Mass, Father Francisco called Emiliano into the quiet of the sacristy. The conversation was a duel between faith and fury. "What are you doing, Emiliano? Justice belongs to God, not to men," the priest pleaded, his voice echoing the genuine concern of one who fears for a friend's soul. He spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of the danger of becoming the monster one hunts. He tried to reach the man he knew, the honorable sergeant, the loving grandfather, but the man before him was someone else, forged in a furnace of loss and betrayal that the priest could not comprehend. Emiliano's reply was delivered in a low tone, almost a whisper, but each word was as sharp as broken glass. "God has all the time in the world to forgive them, Francisco." "I don't," he said, his eyes fixed on a crucifix on the wall. "I'm not seeking divine justice. I'm just scheduling their meeting with the Creator." With that blasphemous declaration, he turned and left, leaving Father Francisco alone with his prayers, feeling the weight of his friend's soul slipping through his fingers. That dialogue was Emiliano's confession, his acceptance of his role as an angel of death in a godless city. As Emiliano continued his hunt, eliminating his grandson's killer in a similarly calculated confrontation, Elena published her first story on the case. She connected the two deaths, highlighting the atypical nature of the violence. Her skeptical editor was reluctant, but the narrative was too strong to ignore. In the article, she theorized about the existence of a lone vigilante, someone from within the system or an outcast with training who had declared war on the cartel. Unknowingly, she gave a voice to a ghost, and with the article's publication, she ignited a dangerous spark of hope in the oppressed heart of the city, while also placing herself in the crosshairs of very powerful forces. The name Elena used, the Vengeful Shadow, was journalistic, but in the streets, among the whispers in markets and bars, a more visceral nickname began to form: El Espectro Gris, the Gray Specter. The name evoked the image of something ethereal and implacable, a ghost of old age who brought death. The legend grew quickly. Small acts of defiance began to appear. A cartel informant turned up tied to a post with a note. A shipment of weapons vanished. People began leaving clues for the Spectre, anonymous messages in discreet places, believing he would find them, that he was the answer to their silent prayers. For justice, Emiliano, isolated in his war, soon noticed this new and unexpected source of information. He found a note in the church confessional, a crude map drawn on a napkin, an address scribbled on a wall. He had unwittingly become a catalyst for the city's silent rebellion. Using this crowdsourced intelligence, his actions became bolder and more impactful. He raided a small accounting office that served as a front for the cartel's money laundering, not to steal, but to burn the records, sowing chaos within the organization. He was no longer just an avenger, he was a disruptor, a ghost sabotaging the crime machine from within. However, each victory exacted a brutal physical price. After a raid on a warehouse, where he narrowly escaped a patrol, he found himself at home, shaking uncontrollably as he stitched a deep gash in his own arm. Pain was a constant companion, a cruel reminder of his limitations. His reflexes were slower, his stamina lower. He swallowed painkillers with gulps of coffee, using military discipline to compartmentalize the pain and carry on. His motivation was the only anesthetic that worked, the image of Miguel's mutilated face overriding every pang of agony in his aging body. The growing legend of El Espectro Gris reached the ears of El Chacal, the sadistic cartel lieutenant directly responsible for ordering Miguel's death. For him, the existence of this vigilante was a personal affront, a humiliation that undermined his authority and spread fear among his men. El Chacal's rage was that of a predator who discovers another hunter in his territory. He needed to crush this myth, to annihilate this hope, and he would do it in the cruelest way possible, to reassert his dominance through absolute terror, showing everyone what happened to those who dared to challenge him. To prove his point, El Chacal ordered the capture of an elderly shopkeeper who had refused to pay the protection fee and who, in a moment of foolish courage, had praised the spectre. The man was dragged from his home and executed in the public square, a sign hung around his neck. This is what happens to friends of the ghost. The news hit Emiliano like a punch to the gut. His solitary war had claimed its first innocent victim. The weight of that death crushed him, adding a layer of guilt to his already overburdened conscience. Vengeance, he realized, was a double-edged sword, and its blade now cut the innocents he had indirectly intended to protect. El Chacal's cruelty ignited a new fire in Elena. Her investigation was no longer just professional, it became personal. She saw the connection between the cartel's violence and the inaction of the police, especially Commander Rivera. Her questions became more incisive, her articles more direct. This did not go unnoticed. One night, her car was blocked by a police cruiser. Rivera stepped out of the shadows, his face a mask of false cordiality. He advised her to focus on more positive stories. About the city, a veiled warning whose threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Elena felt fear, but the intimidation only strengthened her resolve to expose the truth. Emiliano, for his part, knew he had to change tactics. Targeting the pawns was no longer enough. He needed to force the queen out onto the board. His next target was one of El Chacal's top enforcers, a man known for his brutality and his crucial position in the logistics of violence. The hunt for this new target required more sophisticated planning, a level of risk that would test all his limits. He spent sleepless nights studying makeshift blueprints, observing from a distance, living on coffee and the sheer force of his obsession. He was preparing to venture much deeper into the enemy's den. The confrontation with the enforcer was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Emiliano used the very legend surrounding him as a weapon. He created noises, moved objects, cut the power, turning the man's safe house into a haunted one. He was the boogeyman, the whisper in the dark. When he finally revealed himself, the enforcer, a muscular giant accustomed to terrorizing others, was already broken by fear. The ensuing fight was brief. Emiliano didn't need strength, only the terror he himself had sown in his opponent's mind. A soldier's mind, he knew, was always the most lethal weapon of all. Before silencing him, Emiliano extracted the vital information that would seal everyone's fate. El Chacal was throwing a private party at a remote desert hacienda to celebrate a large shipment. It was a gathering of the key members of his faction. Emiliano knew it was the perfect opportunity, the only chance he would have to get to the man who gave the order. He also knew the place would be heavily guarded and that it had all the markings of a suicide mission. But death no longer scared him. He had already died the day he identified Miguel's body. What was left of him was merely the instrument of the promise he had made to his grandson. In the solitude of his house, Emiliano began his final preparations. He cleaned his pistol one last time, the ritual now as natural as breathing. On the table, he spread a makeshift map of the hacienda's region, drawn from the information he had extracted. Every movement, every entry and exit route was calculated. He was no longer the trembling grandfather who played chess with himself. He was Sergeant Cárdenas, planning his final operation. Next to the map, Miguel's photograph watched him. It is in this moment of quiet before the final battle that a man faces his reflection and sees the path he has walked. If Emiliano's journey from grandfather to specter, moves you, know that your support allows me to continue bringing these stories to life. Your subscription is a beacon in the darkness. El Chacal's hacienda was a mirage of opulence in the middle of the Chihuahuan desert, an island of lights and vulgar music in an ocean of darkness and silence. Emiliano watched from a distant hill, the cold desert wind whipping his wrinkled face. He was not a one-man army. He was a ghost. Using his decades of reconnaissance experience, he moved through the shadows, exploiting a flaw in the perimeter fence that his patient observation had revealed. By disabling a secondary generator, he plunged an entire wing of the property into darkness, creating the necessary chaos and distraction. As the guards ran towards the darkness, the Gray Specter slipped inside the compound, a silent predator entering the den of loud, overconfident monsters. Once inside the walls, the air was thick with the smell of expensive liquor, roasted meat, and the arrogance of power. Emiliano moved like a wraith through the service corridors, his worn boots making no sound on the tiled floor. His senses, sharpened by adrenaline and purpose, picked up every conversation, every laugh, every movement. From a shadowed gallery overlooking the main courtyard, he saw him, El Chacal, a glass in his hand, laughing loudly, the center of attention. The sight of his grandson's killer's face made Emiliano's blood boil, but his training kept him cold. Rage was the fuel, but precision was the weapon. He waited, observing, analyzing, awaiting the exact moment to isolate the alpha from the pack. With a stone thrown precisely at a glass window in an isolated wine cellar, Emiliano created the second jarring sound of the night. El Chacal, irritated by his men's incompetence, went to check on the disturbance himself, ordering the others to stay put. In the dim light of the cellar, among oak barrels and dusty bottles, he found Emiliano waiting. The sneer on El Chacal's face froze, replaced by a confused disbelief. "You?" he spat, vaguely recognizing the old man from the police station. "The grandfather? So the specter is you?" The confusion quickly turned to rage. The idea that an old man had terrorized him for weeks was the final insult. The cellar became an arena, the door closing behind them. The fight was a brutal clash between two eras and two styles of violence. El Chacal was a force of nature, a whirlwind of savage punches and kicks, fueled by fury and cocaine. Emiliano was the rock breaking the wave, absorbing, deflecting, using cunning where strength failed. He used the environment, toppling wine racks to create obstacles, using the neck of a broken bottle as a makeshift weapon. Every blow he took sent waves of pain through his frail body, but the image of Miguel's lifeless face was a shield against the agony. In a desperate move, El Chacal pulled a knife, plunging it into Emiliano's side. Emiliano grunted in pain, but used the moment to disarm his opponent. Just as Emiliano, bleeding profusely, finally gained the upper hand, the piercing sound of sirens cut through the night air. Red and blue lights swept across the desert, and state police cruisers stormed the property. But this wasn't the cavalry arriving to save the day. It was Commander Rivera and his most loyal men, arriving not to arrest the criminals, but to protect their assets. For Emiliano, cornered in the cellar with a wounded and furious Chacal, the situation had escalated from a mission of vengeance to a tactical nightmare. He was trapped between the brutality of the cartel and the corruption of the law, an enemy before him and another surrounding him on all sides. The hacienda exploded into a pandemonium of gunfire. Rivera's men, indistinguishable from the cartel thugs in the darkness and chaos, opened fire. Emiliano, using the pain to focus his mind, saw opportunity in the disorder. He pushed the body of a dead cartel guard out of the cellar, drawing the fire of the police. Then he fired his pistol towards the police from a different window, causing the thugs to return fire. He became the phantom conductor of an orchestra of death, turning his enemies against each other. Wounded, bleeding, and operating purely on instinct and will, He was fighting no longer just for vengeance, but for simple, brutal survival. Amidst the crossfire, he saw his chance. El Chacal, trying to drag himself to safety, was exposed. At the same time, through a window, he saw Rivera hastily trying to retrieve a ledger from an open safe, the physical proof of his complicity, the final dilemma: personal vengeance or the greater justice that could bring down the rotten system. For an instant, the sergeant and the grandfather waged a war within him. Then, the decision was made. With a precision that defied his pain, he fired twice. The first bullet struck El Chacal, settling his blood debt. The second shattered Rivera's hand, making him drop the book. Emiliano had fulfilled his promise, but in doing so he collapsed against the wall, gravely wounded, as the chaos continued to reign outside. The desert night swallowed Emiliano. Using the darkness as his last ally, he dragged himself away from the hacienda, which was now a beacon of chaos and violence. Every step was an agony. The wound in his side, a hot well from which his life was draining. The sound of sirens and gunfire became a distant echo, replaced by the humming of the wind and the ragged rhythm of his own breathing. He didn't look back. Under the vast, starry sky, indifferent to the wars of men, Sergeant Cárdenas, the Gray Specter, the avenging grandfather, found precarious shelter behind a rock formation and collapsed, Rivera's ledger pressed against his chest as if it were a sacred text, his only proof that his sacrifice had not been in vain. Before the dawn light painted the desert, Emiliano used his last strength for one final strategic act. He reached a payphone on a dusty road and made a call. His message to Elena was short and cryptic. They met in the gloom of an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the city. Emiliano was an apparition, pale, leaning against the wall to stay upright, his eyes burning with the last ember of his mission. He offered no explanations, told no story. He just held out the ledger to her. "The truth is in here. Make it scream," he whispered. In handing over the proof, he wasn't just passing an object, but the responsibility for justice. His physical war was over. Elena's war, the war of words and truth, was just beginning. The publication of Elena's story, with copies of the ledger's pages splashed across the front page, was like an earthquake. The scandal erupted, exposing the network of bribes, murders, and protection that Commander Rivera provided to the cartel. The evidence was irrefutable. Rivera was disgraced and arrested, his downfall as spectacular as his corruption was deep. Without his protector in the system, and with El Chacal dead, the cartel descended into a brutal internal war, weakened and fractured. From wherever he was, Emiliano had achieved the impossible. He had not only avenged his grandson, but had broken the spine of the rotten system that allowed his death, proving that a single man, driven by grief, could topple giants. Emiliano Cárdenas vanished. His body was never found. To the world, he became a footnote in the Rivera scandal. But in the streets of Juárez, the legend of El Espectro Gris took deep root. It became a cautionary whisper among criminals and a dark fable of hope for the forgotten. Some say he died that same night in the desert, rejoining Sofia and Miguel in the peace of the stars. Others believe he simply walked away, a ghost returning to the nothingness from whence he came. The truth is, he did not find peace. Vengeance cleared his path, but it stained his soul forever. He was not a hero, but a man who loved so much he was forced to become a monster. Emiliano's story ends here, not with a happy ending, but with the bittersweet echo of a justice won at a terrible price. The cycle of violence in Juárez did not end, but one of its heads was severed, and the people were reminded that even the most corrupt systems have cracks. If you believe that journeys like that of this old sergeant, who walked through darkness to find his own kind of light, deserve to be told, I ask you to join us. Your subscription to this channel is the guarantee that the echo of these complex and painfully human voices will never fade. Thank you for accompanying me to the end.